The most important phase of chess is the opening. If you don't get off to a good start, you can forget about the middle game and end game because you're not going to get that far. The way you get off to a good start is by applying the principles of chess, by playing for the center of the board, and by mobilizing your forces effectively right from the beginning. Let's turn our attention to the center. What do we mean by the center? We mean at least the very 4 squares in the middle of the board. But we also mean the area just around those 4 centers, the enlarged center. This is important too. You're going to want to do any of 3 things: occupy the center, guard it, or influence it. That's how you gain control of a chess game. Let's focus on occupying the center as a start. Now, why would you want to occupy the center? Well, from the center, you can move to either side of the board quickly and easily. You have maximum flexibility. Also, if you occupy the center, in a way you present a barrier to your opponent, which prevents him from organizing his forces. And really, there's a more important reason to occupy the center, a third reason, and that is from the center, you have more options. You can attack and guard more squares, and you can move to more squares. For example, let's place a white knight on d5. And we see from this point, the knight attacks 8 different squares. That's the best a knight can do from any situation. Notice, by the way, the knight occupies a light square, but it can only move to dark squares. It's a peculiar feature of the knight. Compare the knight on d5 to it being on a5. How many squares does the knight attack? 4. You've lost half a knight. You can do half as much. So you want to avoid placing your pieces on the edge of the board, especially a knight. Let me see what happens if we put other pieces in the center and compare to being on the edge of the board. Put a bishop on d4, for example. Here it attacks 13 different squares. Put a bishop in the corner. On a1, only 7. It's lost mobility. Put a queen in the center, say on d4. Here, the queen attacks 27 different squares. On any of the corner squares, say a1 again, only 21. It too has lost some of its power. What about the king and the rook? Surprisingly, I know you shouldn't place the king in the center of the board in the opening because it can be subject to attack there. But it does have greater mobility on d4. Here it attacks 8 different squares, and you shift it to the corner, only 3. So it's not particularly effective as an attacking piece from the edge of the board either. Strangely, however, the rook on d4 attacks 14 squares. Place it anywhere else on the board, including a1 or any other corner square, it also attacks 14 different squares. So a rook does not gain in mobility by being in the center of the board. What do you want to do with your rooks? You want to place them on open files so that they can attack the enemy position. That's good enough. At this point, I'd like to turn to a concrete example of the value of occupying the center of the board. Believe it or not, by the way, this game really occurred, this position. It was generated from Stahlberg-Botvinnik, 1940. And here, black, Botvinnik, is totally dominated the center of the board. It's his private vacation spot, it seems. All his pieces occupy central posts within the enlarged center. We have the 2 rooks supported by this linchpin here, this pawn on d5, the knight, the bishop around it, even the queen, although not in the center, backing up the whole fortress. Meanwhile, look at the white pieces. The queen's on the back rank, the bishop, the knight, the rook, of course the king. The only white piece somewhat in the game, and it's not really in the game at all, is the rook at a2. Notice that white's movement is not really hindered by pawns. It's the black pieces occupying the center that have a stranglehold on the whole game. Try to do this in your own play. Now, one other aspect of the center I'd like to touch upon right now is guarding the center. Let's turn to our next board. Obviously, when you occupy the center of the board, You don't necessarily control it because you're not protecting yourself, although often enough you do control it. It also helps to back up the pieces there by guarding them. If you do so right out of the opening with a plan, in some cases we say you're playing a light square game or a dark square game because all the forces are unified in their efforts. They're trying to guard certain squares in particular. Look at this position, and we see that the white pieces are guarding the light squares in the center, essentially. That is, the white knight and bishop, which has been flanked and directed at the central area, guard d5 and e4. The white pawns on c4 and d3 also attack those squares. None of the white development so far is concerned with dark squares. Contrast this with what black has done. We see that the black pawns at d6 and e5 attack centrally located squares on dark squares. And the bishop at g7 and the knight at c6 also are concerned with dark square attacks. So black's playing a dark squared game, and white's playing a light squared game. In general, try to occupy the central squares and support those pieces and forces occupying them by guarding the central region. Now, in addition to occupying and guarding the center, we can influence it, which means we can drive away enemy pieces that attack the center. Many contemporary openings evince this quality. For example, let's start with e4. With that move, white attacks d5 and f5, both in the enlarged center, and that move also allows the queen and bishop to enter the game along diagonals. Let's say black counters with a similar move, e5, allowing his queen and bishop to come out, and also attacking two valuable squares in the central area, d4 and f4. We call this a double king pawn opening because both sides have moved their king pawns to start. Let's say white follows with knight to f3, developing a piece toward the center with a gain of time. We are attacking black's king pawn and thereby forcing black to expend the tempo to guard it. Let's say black plays knight to c6, defending the pawn and getting a piece out also toward the center. And if white now plays bishop to b5, we have the Ruy-Lopez, or Spanish game. The point of this opening is to attack the knight at c6 and at some meaningful time to either exchange the knight or place it in a pin so that e5 is weakened. That is, the square the knight defends. In fact, later on in vintage Lopez's, white often plays d4, pressures e5, and tries to force black into trading pawns. Black, on the other hand, wants white to trade on e5 so that he keeps a fair share of the center. He wants to keep a pawn in the center so that there's a general equality there. An analog to all of this can be seen in our next position, arising from the Scotch game. It starts e4, e5, white plays knight to f3, attacking the pawn again, knight to c6, and instead of bishop to b5, indirectly attacking the center, white plays d4, black exchanges, e takes d4, white takes it back with his knight. And let's say that at this point, black begins an attack against the white center. He plays knight to f6, so that black has the initiative. And let's say white plays knight to c3, defending the e-pawn. Black can now pin the white knight, bishop to b4 in Ruy-Lopez fashion. The knight, being unable to move now, is not defending e4 anymore, so that black may have the opportunity of capturing on that square with his knight from f6. Notice that the bishop on b4, a dark square bishop, is really attacking a light square indirectly. It's attacking e4 because it's attacking the unit that defends that square. Let's go to our third board, another fashionable current, the Nimzo Indian defense, which starts with a queen pawn opening. Let's say white goes d4. At this point, white is threatening to advance the king pawn 2 squares to get a classical pawn center. There are a lot of ways to stop this. We can engage the center by d5, a direct approach, or we can play knight to f6, which also stops e4 without committing our pawn structure to anything definite yet. And let's say white plays c4, which attacks the center and releases the queen, giving it a number of tactical possibilities at various times. And now black has to decide how to develop the king's bishop. Either we can flank it and direct it towards the center, or we can develop it through the center by moving a center pawn. Let's say we play e6, and if white now plays knight to c3, planning e4 and establishing that classical center, black can now play the Nimzo Indian defense. Bishop to b4, pinning the knight. Of course, white can't safely play e2 to e4 because the black knight will capture on that square, in that white's knight is pinned. And once again, we see a dark squared bishop is attacking a light square. In our final example, we see another indirect approach to the center, another way of influencing it. It begins with e4, and now c5, the Sicilian defense. Black's plan out of the Sicilian defense is to exchange the c pawn for white's d pawn, so that afterwards, however this takes place, black winds up with 2 pawns in the center versus white's 1. And therefore, he has a better chance ultimately of controlling that region if he survives the early attack. And let's say, in line with this thinking, white plays knight to f3 to support d4, and black plays d6, which restrains the white king pawn so that later on white's pawn can come under attack, and black doesn't have to worry about this pawn advancing because the square it would advance to is guarded. Let's say white opens up d4, black does exchange, and white takes it back, knight takes d4, and now black continues by pressuring that white king pawn, the only pawn actually occupying a central square. Knight to f6. So it's a target. When you occupy the center, you can also be a target because you're right out there where the enemy pieces can get to you. Knight to c3, defending it. And now if black continues a6 with the knight off Sicilian, we have a very interesting indirect attack emerging. Now this may seem somewhat chaotic, a6, but actually it guards b5, preventing a knight or bishop move to that square. But its long-range plan is quite interesting. Black hopes to play b5 and ultimately b4, dislodging the white knight at c3. And if that moves, black may be able to gain the e4 pawn. So, in your own games, try to occupy the center and guard it, but don't forget to influence it. If you want to play for the center of the board, you have to develop your pieces quickly and powerfully. You have to galvanize them into action. To do that, you have to move the right pawns. You have to get 1 or 2 pawns out of the way and then start developing your back units. Which pawns to move? The D and E pawns. For example, after D2 to D4 and E2 to E4, you occupy 2 central squares and you guard the other 2. You can now very easily, without any difficulty, get the rest of your units out. Knight to C3, for example, knight to F3, and not necessarily in this order. Bishop to C4, bishop to F4. All the minor pieces are in action. You can then develop the queen in a useful way, queen to D2 or E2 or queen to D3. And you can castle. It doesn't matter which way in this particular case because black isn't responding, but we don't need it to respond. Let's say white castles queenside, where the rook comes to D1 right away, affecting the center, and then the other rook joins it on the E file, so that the rooks back up the central advance. Notice the minor pieces are posted well, the queen is out there, the rooks support the attack into the black camp and position, the white king is out of the way. How many pawns have we moved? Just 2. These are the right pawns to move because they maximize development possibilities. The wrong pawns to move are the ones on the edge of the board. The queen and king rook pawns, for example, the bishop pawns perhaps early, and the knight pawns, although the rook pawns tend to be worst. Move over to this board here, and we will see what happens when you move the wrong pawns. Let's say white begins with f3, not a very valuable move. It doesn't allow any minor pieces to come out. It does attack the center, but exposes the white king to attack along the e1, h4 diagonal. Let's say black plays e5 so that the queen can come into action, heading for h4, and white responds with g4. A totally unnecessary move, and in fact a losing one, because black now plays queen to h4, checkmate, the fool's mate. Now you may say that, well, I'm not going to fall into this line of attack, and certainly no good player would. But that's not true. For example, this really took place. White played d4, two masters. Knight f6. White responded knight to d2. Not the best development, but not the worst. e5, a sharp, perhaps overreaction. D takes e5. Black's knight is attacked. It went to safety, knight to g4, and it, of course, attacked the pawn in doing so. White should now develop a new piece, protect the pawn, and start building his centralized game. But no, White thought he had the time to drive away the black knight. Well, things don't work out so perfectly in this microcosm of the real world. Knight to e3. Not much choice for white here if he wants to save his queen. F takes e3, but what did that do? It opened the e1, h4 diagonal, and now the black queen zooms along one diagonal to garner another, and white is going to be mated next move. White can block the attack g3. Doesn't help very much because after queen takes g3, it's a version of the fool's mate. In your own games, try to move the right pawn so that you can mobilize all your forces effectively right from the start. Don't, if you can, move flank pawns unless you have to, because if you do so, you're going to fall behind in development and wind up in trouble. e4, d4 is such a good plan. White's trying to achieve it right out of the opening. Black, of course, is trying to stop white from doing this. He can do it in a number of ways. After e4, black can play e5. This more or less stops an immediate d4 because if white played it, black would take it off. Either white's queen would have to come to the center or black would have to sacrifice a pawn for activity's sake. And you don't want to sacrifice your material without a very good reason, though this is a possibility here. Still, it requires some commitment from white, the sacrifice of one pawn. Black could also kind of discourage white from playing d4 with c5, the Sicilian defense. Once again, if we played d4, black could take it off, and either white would have to sacrifice a pawn or take it back with his queen, subjecting it to knight attack from c6. And we could surely stop white from playing d4 if we attack the e-pawn directly, if we played knight to f6, Alyekin's defense, for example. White could not play d4 because he would hang the e-pawn. And by the same token, the move d5, the center counter game, would stop white from playing d4 because black's pawn would take white's. In fact, what white should do here is take black's pawn instead, and either black will offer a pawn sacrifice or take it back with his queen. And white would start to attack the queen. What you wouldn't want to do, by the way, is to play king to e2. Not that you would, but that would lead to queen to e4 mate. Now, after moving the right pawns, you're going to want to develop your minor pieces, your bishops and your knights. Very often you develop at least one knight before developing any bishops, because developing a knight is a less committal action. You know where you want to put your knights more or less, on the bishop 3 squares, because they have more or greater mobility from those points. Bishops you have more options with, and you're not as sure where you want to develop them to right away. Take the Ruy Lopez, for example, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a very aggressive move. Or in the Joko piano, you'll play the bishop to c4. That's where it goes. Or in the two knights, if black then follows with this move. Again, aiming at f7. And in the Scotch game, you often play the bishop to d3. For example, d4 takes, knight takes, knight f6 on black's part, attacking white's king pawn. White trades on c6. And now, to defend the e-pawn, white might play bishop to d3. And there are times when you might play the bishop to e2. Consider Alyekin's defense. e4, knight f6 attacking the pawn, e5 saving it, the knight moves again to safety, knight d5, d4, d6 attacking the e-pawn, knight to f3 so that white can capture with a knight on e5 if an exchange takes place in that square. Let's say black pins the knight, preventing that possibility. And now white might want to play bishop to e2, breaking the pin so that he could still take back on e5. Let's say at this point, black inserts bishop takes f3, trying to get away with a fast one. And white takes it back, bishop takes f3. And now let's say black takes on e5 so that white can't take back on that square with a piece. We have a trick up our sleeve. c4. And notice the black knight at d5 is pinned to the b7 pawn. You're going to want to avoid this kind of thing, of course. Finally, we can even place the bishop, in some cases, on the flank. Take the flank Sicilian, e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, opening up in the center. Black takes it back, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6 attacking the king pawn, and now knight c3. And let's say black plays a move like e6, guarding the central region and allowing the king's bishop to come up one square. White, if he chose, could now flank his king's bishop and put it over here. So we see there are many more options with bishops, and you might want to hold back a bit before developing them. So after moving the pawns in the center, try to get out your minor pieces, at least one knight first, and then you're starting to get ready for business. One admonitory note here. You don't want to just get your minor pieces out there. You have to be careful not to block your other forces. For example, bishop to d3 here, putting the bishop in front of the center pawn, prevents you from moving that center pawn and releasing your queenside pieces. By the same token, you don't want to put your knights in the way of your bishops so that you inhibit their scope. Let's look at a game illustrating this. White began e4, black played d6, white played d4, and now black played a Pirc-like formation, g6. He's going to place his bishop on the flank and direct it towards the center, a fianchetto, an Italian word. White played knight f3, developing the knight toward the center, attacking it and supporting the central pawns. Black played bishop to g7, and now bishop to c4, focusing on black's very weak f7 square. And here black played knight d7, which may look okay, but actually it prevents this bishop from guarding e6, and it falls right into a combination. White played bishop f7 check. What do you do about it? If you ignore it, we've gotten a pawn for nothing and ruined your castled king's position. If you take it off, we have the follow-up knight to g5 check. Take that, Charlie. Where do you go with your king? Do you move it back and allow your queen to be smothered? I don't think so. Do you instead go king to f8, permitting a knight fork on e6? See how weak that square is? The bishop not guarding it because the knight's in the way? Or do you do as black did in the actual game against world champion Tal and play king to f6, allowing an unceremonious mate in one move, queen to f3. So be careful when you develop your knights as well. You don't want to place them in the way of your bishops. Let me show you another example of this. Sometimes it can get really horrendous, as in e4, e6, the French defense, d4, d5, black's getting some kind of measure of power in the center. And let's say white plays knight to d2, defending the e-pawn and placing the knight in the way of this bishop. Certainly an okay thing at this point, if you're careful. Let's say black follows suit with c5, being aggressive, and that white exchanges pawns in the center. E takes d5, e takes d5, and then he plays d takes c5, bringing the black bishop, after bishop takes c5, to a really nice post where it bears down on f2. And let's say white kind of mechanically and blindly plays knight to e2. You don't have to be an Einstein here to see that these two bishops are blocked in and they can't move. And that after queen to b6, setting up a diagonal battery aimed at f2, white has no satisfactory answer to cope with that threat. There's no way to protect that pawn. And if you move, let's say, the king's knight somewhere, g3 or c3, you're going to run smack into bishop takes f2 check, king up, queen mate. Even if you move the other knight, it wouldn't be much better. Let's say you went somewhere with this knight to b3, engaging a little battle on the queen side. We would still play bishop takes f2 check. The king would have to go to d2, and once again, queen e3 would be mate. So this is a really terrible example of it. You don't want to put your knights in the way of your bishops. You don't want to put your bishop in the way of your center pawns. One final point about knights being on king 2 and queen 2. When they occupy squares not on the third rank, such as bishop 3, they allow the queen to come into the game. For example, in this position, white can play knight to g5, hitting the f pawn. And if black castles here, white follows up with queen to h5, not only threatening the f pawn for a third time. There's a white bishop on c4, a knight on g5, and a queen on h5, all attacking f7. But white's threatening checkmate at h7. And you can't handle both threats simultaneously. Black must lose something. If the knight had been here on f6 instead of e7, white wouldn't have this possibility. White wouldn't be able to bring the queen into action at h5. Also, notice that on f6, the knight guards h7. So, when you develop your minor pieces, try not to block your center pawns, try not to put your knights in the way of your bishops, and try to be aggressive about your development. Place your knights, especially on bishop 3, if you can. One of the biggest problems in the opening is not wasting time. And one of the biggest time wasters is moving the same piece repeatedly. Consider this example. e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, takes, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and now black plays the dragon Sicilian, g6. He's going to fianchetto his bishop and direct it at the white center. This is called the dragon because once the knight comes to this square, it's supposed to be the outline of a dragon. Use your imagination on it. Let's say white continues bishop to e3, and now black violates a principle. He moves his knight, which is already out for a second time. He plays knight to g4, thinking that white's going to have to wait some time and move his bishop. Doesn't work that way. It may also seem that the bishop at c8 protects the knight on g4. It won't in a move. After bishop to b5 check, black is unable to intercede on the diagonal by knight to c6 because white can just take it off. And the result is a devastating fork at c6. That leaves blocking the check, not by putting something in the way at c6, but at d7. Notice that the bishop on d7 is now pinned. Therefore, it's not defending the knight on g4, and we can just pick this off. White has 5 pieces out, black has 1, and he's down 1 piece overall. So try not to move the same piece over and over. Another time waster is giving a pointless check. It may seem like a good thing to do to check as soon as you can, but it doesn't help at all unless it's a really useful move. Like anything else, checks should be desirable as moves. For example, after e4, e5, knight f3, d6, Philidor's defense, white could now play bishop to b5 check. But this is a waste of time because after black plays c6, white's only going to have to move the bishop again. And this is not a valueless move, c6. It strikes at the white center. and gives the queen outlet to the queen side. So don't give pointless checks. Sometimes it can be really hurtful. For example, take the Petrov defense. E4, E5, knight F3, knight F6. Black plays